Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Larigakis, president of the American Hellenic Institute, and it is a pleasure to welcome you once again to one of our AHI Virtual Speakers Forum. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus here over the course of the last couple of months, during the month of August and September, but we are now ready to go once again during this fall season with another slate of very interesting and unique forthcoming virtual forums, of which today we are very proud of to have the one on impact of the 2020 elections and U.S. policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. We all follow very closely these elections and what they might mean for a whole number of issues, but here at the American Hellenic Institute, we have a vested interest in knowing what the next president policies will be regarding the area of the world that we follow very closely, that being the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have gathered two expert panelists here today, in Dr. Ted Carpenter and Dr. Andrew Novo, both experts in the field of foreign policy and who follow very carefully the developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. And today's guest moderator will be one of our own, a member of the board of directors for many years, Mr. Nick Chimicles. I will be back in a few minutes to introduce all three of them. But for all of us who have been following the developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's been exceptionally a very turbulent and difficult period over the course of really the last 7 months, which began back on the Evros border river with Greece and Turkey in March, where President Erdogan tried to have illegal immigrants go through the Greek border. And it has continued throughout the months from March on and culminated in an apex during the late part of July and especially through the months of August, where he sent a survey ship, the Larigakis, into Greece's territorial waters, where in a provocative manner and drilling illegally in Greece's continental shelf and waters. All this and so much more that Turkey has done to create instability in the region has been well documented, and I'm sure our speakers will get into it in a few minutes. The Trump administration has been overall very good in terms of their reactions to what's been going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Secretary Pompeo has made 2 visits of unprecedented nature, frankly, within the last couple of months to Cyprus and to Greece. And in both cases, proclaiming the importance of both countries to the national security interests of the United States. And of course, calling Greece, as others have done, a pillar of stability. We certainly subscribe to that formula as well. We think Greece and Cyprus make up a very important dual and projection of U.S. geostrategic interests. But Turkey continues to promote instability in the region. And only within the last couple of days, we've seen 2 more actions with that of reopening illegally against UN General Council, Security Council resolutions, the Svetsov city of Arosha, and also just a couple of days, again, sending out the Larigakis with another illegal NAVTEX, 6.5 miles just off the coast of Kostolorizo, an area of Greece claims obviously being its own sovereign territory. The Trump administration has come out with strong statements on both these actions, and I'm sure, again, our 2 speakers today will address that. The Vice President Biden, over the years, is no stranger to our issues, and he has made exceptional comments over the years, including calling for Turkey to leave Cyprus and the illegal troops there. He's called, of course, good comments regarding the Patriarchate and for the religious freedom to be supported by Turkey regarding the Patriarchate. So this and so many more things are going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. And now we're going to turn our attention to our 2 speakers here today that will take us forth in this very important discussion and to see what will another re-election of the Trump administration mean for policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, if Vice President Biden is to win, what will that ultimately mean for the region? If I may now just provide a few comments regarding who our speakers are today. Dr. Ted Carpenter is a senior fellow for defense and foreign policy studies at Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 12 books and more than 850 articles. He received his PhD in U.S. diplomatic history from the University of Texas in 1980. Dr. Carpenter, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, is a contributing editor at the National Interest and the American Conservative. He also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Strategic Studies. Dr. Carpenter's work has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the USA Today, amongst many other publications. He is a frequent guest on radio and television programs in the US and throughout the world. And of course, it's a pleasure to have him here once again with us. Dr. Andrew Novo is making his first appearance at an American Hellenic Institute event, and we welcome him. He is an associate professor of strategic studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy and a Master's of Philosophy from the University of Oxford and an AB from Princeton University. A scholar of ancient and modern Mediterranean history, strategic studies, and military history, Dr. Novo also teaches as an adjunct at Georgetown's Wall School of Foreign Service and is a non-resident fellow with the Center for European Policy's Transatlantic Defense and Security Program. He's the author of numerous academic articles and 4 books. His research interests include great power competition, Mediterranean history, grand strategy, and American foreign policy. And leading in the discussion today, as I mentioned earlier, is our guest speaker, our guest moderator, our own here at the American Hellenic Institute, Nicholas Chimicles. Nicholas Chimicles is the founder and senior partner of Chimicles, Schwartz, Kriner, and Donaldson-Smith LLP, and until recently, for 25 years, was known as Chimicles and Takalis. It is a 20-lawyer law firm with offices in Haverford, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware, that specializes in representing consumers and investors in class action litigation. Mr. Chimicles is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Virginia School of Law, and has served as a member of the board of directors of numerous nonprofit organizations that serve the underrepresented and underprivileged. Mr. Chimicles is a recipient of the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, an Archon, and a member of the Leadership 100. And of course, most importantly, he has been a distinguished and very prominent member of the board of directors of the American Hellenic Institute for many years. And it is a great pleasure to welcome him today, as I do each and every one of you. And now I will pass the program on to Mr. Chimicles for this very important discussion that we look forward to having. So thank you very much, and I'll see you at the end of the program.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you to our speakers today, Dr. Carpenter and Dr. Novo. Nick has provided us with, I think, a very good framework for the discussion we're going to have over the next hour. There is clearly a significant intersection that we're about to hit between a significant election that is about to take place 3 weeks from today, and the future of political and economic stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. Nick has indicated some very recent events that have occurred that can be viewed in some quarters as provocations, and we need to address how the United States plays a part in dealing with such provocations, particularly between NATO members. So let's not take any more time listening to those of us who are not experts in the field. Let's go to the experts. And Dr. Carpenter, I think you're up.
Thank you very much, Nick. There is likely to be a change in U.S. policy if President Trump does not win re-election. I think it's fair to say that former Vice President Biden would adopt a policy that is at least somewhat more critical of Turkey's behavior than what we have seen with the Trump administration. President Trump has had an interesting relationship with Turkey's President Erdogan, and part of that seems to be an affinity for autocratic rulers. President Trump gets along rather well with a number of them, and President Erdogan would be at or near the top of the list. One shouldn't overrate the likely change, though, in US policy if a Biden administration comes to power in January of 2021. The United States has had a long-standing strategic relationship with Turkey, and that has weathered a number of difficulties over the decades. I think it's fair to say that within the US military, within the US foreign policy establishment, within the intelligence bureaucracy, Turkey throughout the Cold War era was regarded as an absolutely essential US ally. It was seen as the anchor of Nato in southeastern Europe. It was seen as the channel for NATO and US influence going into the Middle East. And it was seen as a force for strategic stability. Even during the Cold War, that view was somewhat overdone. As we know, Turkey engaged in a number of disruptive actions throughout the Cold War. The invasion of Cyprus, the amputation of the northern part of the island was certainly the most obvious disruptive action. But time and time again, Turkey would send its military planes to violate Greek airspace. And I think it's fair to say that Athens has had to spend a large portion of its military budget to deal with a supposed NATO ally, at least as much as it did to deal with outside threats. In the post-Cold War era, it is really a misnomer to regard Turkey as a force for stability or NATO's essential southeastern anchor. Turkey, especially once Mr. Erdogan came to power, has been very much a force for instability rather than stability. And we have seen that on multiple fronts. Even Turkey's on-again, off-again, on-again relationship with Russia has been cause for concern in Washington and throughout NATO capitals. One recalls the incident in 2015 when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter simply for violating Turkish airspace for all of 17 seconds. I thought at the time, imagine if Greece had adopted anything resembling that standard for dealing with the constant intrusion of Turkish combat aircraft. I think Greece would have shot down several dozen planes every month, given Turkey's actions toward its NATO ally. So that was a rather frightening incident. If President Putin had reacted differently, for example, launching an attack on the Turkish missile battery that had fired on the plane, that could have created an immediate military crisis, with Turkey obviously invoking Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty that proclaims that an attack on any NATO member is considered an attack on all. Then we saw President Erdogan go to the opposite extreme with the purchase of S-400 anti-aircraft missiles from Russia, something that was vehemently opposed by the United States and virtually all other NATO members. And we have Turkey lobbying openly for at least easing, if not lifting, sanctions on Russia for its various actions. Turkey today, at best, can be described as a loose cannon NATO member. At worst, it is a disloyal and disruptive and completely unpredictable NATO member. Consider Turkey's actions against Greece and other interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, the attempted resource grab, and the various provocations that Ankara has engaged in over the past 7 or 8 months. Consider Turkey's actions in Libya, where it has become a thoroughly disruptive force, interfering in the civil war in that country and making tensions even worse than they would have been just given the internal forces in that highly unstable country. Consider Turkey's recent actions with regard to Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Turkey is actively trying to stir up tensions and provoke even greater response from Azerbaijan forces against Armenia. This is while Russia and other countries are trying to dampen the tensions. So this is a NATO member that does not serve the cause of peace, does not serve the cause of stability. And I have recommended now for several years that it is time for NATO to reconsider its association with Turkey. Is it time to expel Turkey from the NATO alliance? Personally, I believe it is. Indeed, I would argue that it is an action that is overdue. This action should have been taken several years ago. NATO now has a thoroughly undemocratic, authoritarian member. Even worse, it has a member state that is highly disruptive and unpredictable and not particularly reliable or loyal. So one has to ask, what exactly does Turkey bring to the table for NATO or any other security entity with regard to Europe and the Middle East? This is not an ally that the United States can afford to have going forward. And I would argue it is not an ally that NATO as an alliance should have going forward. I know that that would be a dramatic change in NATO's posture, in US policy, to shun Turkey, to regard it as at best an unpredictable force and at worst a disruptive threat to the peace and stability of the Eastern Mediterranean region and beyond. But it's time to face reality. Whether President Trump wins re-election in November, or whether Joe Biden becomes the 46th president of the United States, the issue of Turkey and its behavior is not going to go away. This is something that US policymakers have to face. It is something that other NATO governments have to face going forward. In addition, I think that we need to even look beyond NATO. We need to regard the European Union as something more than an economic association. It is time for the EU to step up as a political and security body. The European Union needs to take primary responsibility for the security of Europe and for managing Europe's relations with the Middle East and other regions. That might be bad news for Turkey. Right now, Turkey has the advantage of its NATO membership. Cyprus, for example, is not a NATO member, which puts it at a disadvantage in its contested relationship with Turkey. With the European Union, the reverse is the case. Cyprus has the advantage of membership. Turkey does not. And I think that given the attitude of some key European Union members at the moment, Turkey would find itself under even more criticism than it has from NATO as an entity. President Macron of France, for instance, is clearly, thoroughly disgusted and worried about Turkey's resource grab in the Eastern Mediterranean and its other disruptive behavior in that part of the world. He is ready to confront Turkey. I think he's ready to rally other European Union members to confront Turkey and its actions. So the United States and other NATO powers need to recognize the potential of the European Union to help deal with this issue going forward. So I would argue that the US election is an important factor with regard to Turkey's relationship with the West, with regard to US policy toward Turkey going forward, but it's not likely to be a decisive factor. Other factors, other deep-seated factors are going to play a more important role. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. And a number of questions are going to come up based on the things that you've just shared with us. Dr. Novo, your remarks, please.
Yes, thank you. Is the audio all right?
Yes.
Great. So, so thank you to everyone, to AHI, of course, and to Nick Larigakis, and thank you, Mr. Chimicles, for being the moderator for today's discussion. Thank you also to our audience. I understand there are a few people out in the audience, so we look forward to the discussion with you later. Before I begin, I need to give my DoD disclaimer. So as a federal employee, as a professor at National Defense University, and none of what I say reflects the official views of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the US government more broadly. But so with that out of the way, I want to use my introductory comments to lay out three critical issues shaping US policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. Dr. Carpenter just highlighted a few very important aspects, particularly relating to America's relationship with Turkey and also with the European Union. So what I have is not really a comprehensive look, and I look forward to our discussion and questions from our guests. But the first point I want to highlight is to remember the essential importance of the Eastern Mediterranean to the United States right now. The Eastern Mediterranean is not only important to organizations like the American Hellenic Institute and to those of us who study the area. The Eastern Mediterranean represents the frontier of both NATO through Greece and Turkey and the European Union through Greece and Cyprus. Politics in the Eastern Mediterranean touches on several critical ongoing conflicts: the Syrian civil war, the violence between Israelis and Palestinians, and even violence in Iraq. Russian involvement in Syria and its influence elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean remains a concern for American policymakers, as does Iranian influence in Iraq, Syria's civil war, and the perennial crises of Lebanon. The Eastern Mediterranean, of course, embraces Israel, a key American ally. Under the present administration, relations between the United States and Israel are extremely strong, underpinned in part by the shared political agenda of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Energy discoveries and production have also highlighted the region's importance for international energy markets. The sale of Israeli gas to Egypt and potential export of gas from Egypt and Cyprus and Israel to Europe add to the region's economic and political significance. For Israel, gas discoveries also mean a new focused west toward the sea, pursued in conjunction with its traditional orientation toward its security architecture and land borders in the east. Economic opportunities have created new political realities. For example, 3 weeks ago, 6 nations, Egypt, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and Jordan, signed an agreement creating the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, the EMGF. France has applied to join, and the United States has asked for observer status. This is just one of a number of agreements among these governments in various triads and 3+1 formations. It highlights the new ways they are trying to coordinate efforts and improve stability and productivity in the region. From an American perspective, stable democracies like Cyprus and Greece are invaluable partners in working to achieve and maintain stability in the broader region. Now, this American search for stability brings me to my second point, which is the strength of bilateral relations between the United States and Greece and between the United States and Cyprus. Dr. Carpenter highlighted the unstable and difficult nature of American relations with Turkey, and so the converse has been true for American relations with Greece and Cyprus. Public statements and practical actions during the past several years have clearly demonstrated a positive trend in these two bilateral relationships. A few examples can illustrate the point. In terms of American relations with Greece, we've witnessed the 2019 defense agreement between Athens and Washington, which among other things gave American forces increased freedom to use Greece's seaport infrastructure. American companies and the American military are building relationships in and around the northern Greek port of Alexandroupolis, expanding America's investment in and involvement with the port. America is expanding its base in Souda Bay, Crete, amid speculation that various military assets might be transferred there from Incirlik in Turkey on a more permanent basis. Last month, of course, the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, visited both Greece and Cyprus in a show of support. Pompeo expressed deep concerns for Turkey's ongoing operations in the waters off of Greece and Cyprus. And just this morning, in fact, the State Department urged Turkey to end its calculated provocation off the Greek island of Kastellorizo with the Uruçrais exploratory vessel once more at sea. Cypriot-American relations have also improved. In August 2019, Cyprus's first military attaché to the United States assumed his duties in Washington. In July 2020, Cyprus was added to the list of countries eligible for international military education and training, IMET funding, and cooperation beginning in the 2021 financial year. Since that's one aspect of American policy that my college is particularly involved with, I was very happy to see that. Just last month, Secretary Pompeo communicated to President Anastasiadis of Cyprus that America would temporarily lift the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, ITAR ban on the export of non-lethal defense articles to Cyprus. A more permanent change to the legislation is pending, but these events are concrete steps in improving both bilateral relationships. An obstacle to continued deepening relationships and a clearer picture of American foreign policy, however, has been a degree of instability and unpredictability present in American policymaking. And that's the third point I'd like to flag. Almost a year ago, America's withdrawal of most of its forces from Syria after a phone call between President Erdogan and President Trump was criticized by some as an abandonment of both American Kurdish allies and American interests in the region. Republican senators, as well as former defense officials and military commanders, were quick to condemn the move in strong language. For some time, the personal relationship between the two presidents and their ability to work together has been reported by the media and confirmed by President Trump a number of times. Dr. Carpenter also alluded to this sort of relationship between the two men. Beyond individuals, though, of course, on a more structural level, the turnover within the Trump administration has been high at times. This is a familiar phenomenon to most of you at high levels on the National Security Council, for example, to include the position of the National Security Advisor itself, but also at deputy and assistant secretary levels within the State Department and the Department of Defense. There has been turnover. There has been an increasing number of individuals carrying out their duties on an acting basis, and even empty seats with no officials in them at all. So this sort of turnover makes it more challenging for other nations to apprehend the direction of American foreign policy and to forge and maintain the relationships that turn policy into reality. Part of this challenge also is simply the nature of the American political system. With power divided among two federal legislative bodies and the executive branch, reaching a broad and lasting agreement on what foreign policy should be and how it should work is always challenging. And part of how we look at the impact of the 2020 election will not simply be to think about who sits in the White House come January 2021, but what sort of Congress the president will have to work with. So I will leave my comments there, and I look forward to our discussion and to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Novo. let's pick up on your last point, and that is the instability of the U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. And in that connection, let me allude to the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who wrote the book that received quite a bit of coverage a couple of months ago, Room Where It Happened. John Bolton was interviewed over this past weekend in the Cato newspaper. And he said, with regard to, and this is specifically with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean, he said many of the decisions he, meaning the president, made in the national security space when I was there certainly, depended less on the merits of the policies we were discussing than on what he expected the political reaction in the United States to be to the choices that he made. So if he's reelected, a significant political guardrail will be removed. And his comments were particularly circling in on the threat that was made by President Trump during his first term with respect to withdrawing the United States from NATO. And that threat was made both to American political leaders as well as to European political leaders, and was abandoned. And the point Bolton was making in this article over the weekend is that if there is a second Trump term, the concern about re-election, the so-called political guardrail that he was referring to, will be absent. And that the threat of the US withdrawal from NATO may become a reality. The question I have for both of you is, what would it mean to NATO, which just passed its 70th, it commemorated its 70th anniversary this past year. What would it mean to NATO and to the Eastern Mediterranean if the United States were to withdraw from NATO?
Andrew, do you want to take that first?
Well, it's a very modest question, so yeah, it's a fairly easy answer. Of course, it's a dramatic question. I mean, the obvious answer is NATO is nothing without the United States, and so an American withdrawal from NATO would be disastrous on at least 3 levels. I mean, the first level where it would be disastrous is that it would be disastrous for NATO's capabilities. The second level where it would be disastrous is it would be disastrous for the concept of broader international cooperation and international institutions, because NATO represents one of the great success stories of international institutions. And the third level where it would be a disaster is that it would be a disaster for America's relationships with our European partners, which Dr. Carpenter talked about quite elegantly, and it's a significant issue. So I think that it's also not entirely realistic to think that the United States would withdraw from NATO, but then again, we've seen rather unrealistic possibilities become realities under this administration. So I think that without the United States, NATO is dead, and that would be a geopolitical tragedy.
We finally have an area of significant disagreement. I would argue, first of all, that President Trump's threat to have the United States withdraw from NATO was always based on a lack of greater financial burden sharing, greater defense effort on the part of the European members. That's actually not a new theme. That has gone back decades, where administration after administration in the United States has complained about European underinvestment in defense, European failure to take security issues with sufficient seriousness. And I think with President Trump, that point was made with somewhat greater directness, if not crudity, but it's not new. Secondly, I have argued for some time that NATO is very much an obsolete institution, that President Trump actually had that right, and that a good many scholars have made that point over the past 2 decades or so. that it's time for the Europeans to step up, whether that means European leadership of NATO as an entity, or the transfer of security responsibilities from NATO to the European Union, or the creation of a new European-controlled security organization. But the days of the early Cold War are in the distant past. Europe has the capability to manage its own security, with the United States acting as a backstop, not the dominant figure within the Western alliance. And I think it is time to move in that direction. That has to be a gradual process, but it doesn't mean the end of the world if the United States begins to transfer its security responsibilities, its security leadership to the Europeans. After all, the United States has a rather severe security challenge on the other side of the world. And I think regardless of who wins the election in November, that's going to be America's #1 security priority moving forward through the next 4 years. And that country obviously is China. So Europe is going to be somewhat on the back burner, regardless of whether we have a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. That's just a geostrategic reality.
Given that comment that you've just made, Dr. Carpenter, about NATO being obsolete, why would Turkey view its ouster from NATO as being a matter of any significance?
They would resent the reduction in leverage as they perceive it. I think after a period of time, they would regard it as not a minor development, but something other than a catastrophic development either. Turkey is charting its own very nationalistic foreign policy. It's looking east as much as it is looking west these days. And so NATO membership, I believe, for Erdogan and his associates is regarded as desirable. It's not regarded as essential anymore.
Both of you have mentioned the conflicts that are currently manifest between Russia and Turkey. And I think you've mentioned the three that come to mind immediately, the different sides they've taken in the Libyan civil war, the situation in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the situation that they are confronting in Syria, where there has been actual armed conflict. Is there any way for the United States to exploit that conflict, which, by the way, Russia and Turkey over the last 250 years have had something like a dozen wars between them. So this type of conflict between those two countries is really nothing new. But is there a way that the United States can exploit that to benefit itself and certainly the stability in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, if I may, I mean, I think connected to your question, but responding to a point that Dr. Carpenter just made about Turkey's relationship with NATO and its membership in NATO, I think that the crisis points that it has with Russia relate to the importance of NATO for Turkey. I think one reason that Turkey is able to engage in its rather provocative behavior, for example, shooting down Russia's plane, or now sending mercenaries to fight in Azerbaijan on its own behalf for its own reasons, is that Turkey uses NATO. It uses NATO as a shield because it's sort of banking on that protection. Russia's not going to really hurt us in Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia's not going to retaliate against us shooting down a plane because we are backed by NATO at the end of the day. And so I think that if Turkey loses the support of NATO, and that doesn't have to be, by the way, Turkey getting kicked out of NATO. It could be many, many things far short of that, stopping intelligence sharing, not deploying NATO forces or basing them in Turkey, even sort of making a statement by NATO to the effect of, if you engage in this and this behavior, we are not going to view Article 5 as valid if you are attacked by someone else. That this is why Turkey doesn't want to lose its NATO membership.
I think that's
In terms of America leveraging its position based on the disagreements between Turkey and Russia to benefit our interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, you see the way that Turkey's problems with the United States has led to stronger relations between the United States and Greece and Cyprus, which was the substance of my introductory comments. That has helped increase America's position in the region and has brought America closer to those countries. Other than that, we're going to be faced with a fundamental foreign policy decision of, how far do we back Turkey if Turkey wants to confront Russia, as opposed to how far are we willing to say to Turkey, what you're doing is wrong, even if it's provocative to Russia. As in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, you're taking Syrian mercenaries from the battlefield in Syria or in Libya, and you're shipping them to Nagorno-Karabakh to fight Armenia as your proxies because you have a problematic history with Armenia that goes back a very long time. It's going to be difficult for the United States to say that, but we may have to say, on this issue, we're actually closer to the position of Russia and further from the position of Turkey. But that's a very difficult foreign policy reorientation for the United States to undertake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the key point. One can make the case that Turkey's continued membership in NATO benefits Turkey. It's harder and harder to make the case that continued Turkish membership in NATO benefits the United States and the other NATO members in Europe. Very hard to make that case now.
Mm-hmm. A lot has been written and a lot has been complained about by Greece and Cyprus with regard to the issue of maritime jurisdiction and the incursions by Turkey with respect to mineral exploration in Greek and Cypriot EEZ zones or exclusive economic zones. One problem is that Turkey is not a signatory of the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, which has been around for decades and is supposed to provide a framework for resolving disputes between countries with regard to maritime jurisdiction. How is it that there is a path forward here in terms of trying to resolve the very palpable maritime jurisdiction issues with regard to Turkey's incursions if they are a non-signatory and they simply are refusing to recognize, for example, Cyprus's EEZ going beyond the 12-mile zone as opposed to the 200-mile zone that the Convention on the Law of the Seas provides? How will that be? How is that a resolvable dispute?
Well, I think it's very awkward for the United States to make much of a case criticizing Turkey's actions when the United States itself is not a member of a signatory to the Law of the Sea Treaty. So I think most of the European nations, whether acting through the EU or individually, are in a better position to place pressure on Turkey to take a principled position against Turkey's actions in the Eastern Med than the United States is. There again, I think another reason for the European powers to really step forward and be a force for stability, for the rule of international law.
Dr. Novo?
So there are a couple of points about the exploration off of Greece and Cyprus. On Cyprus in particular, it's more fundamental than Turkey not recognizing the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus. Turkey doesn't recognize the existence of a sovereign entity called the Republic of Cyprus. And so in the case of Cyprus, it's even more fundamental than it is with Greece. And to Dr. Carpenter's repeated point about the European Union, this is a big issue. I mean, Turkey engages with the European Union. Turkey is in theory still a candidate member to join the European Union, and it does so from the position of not recognizing one of the members of the European Union as a state. And so when you talk about a solution to the problem, either for Cyprus's exclusive economic zone or Greece's, or if you bundle them together, you have to remember that Turkey is, for the case of Cyprus specifically, so they are looking for solutions that will involve greater rights and greater concessions for Turkish Cypriots and greater resolution of the breakaway state that they have created, state in quotes, that they have created in the north. So those issues are together. In the case of resolving the issue with Greece, or more broadly, it reflects a tendency in Turkish foreign policy for at least the last 80 years or 90 years since the foundation, or 100 years even since the foundation of the modern Turkish Republic, which is provocation to achieve concessions. So in the 1950s, when Turkey had various views on the concessions they needed over Cyprus, their provocation was to threaten an immediate partition of the island. They had riots. They started riots in Istanbul. They started riots in Cyprus. In both cases, they actually bombed themselves and then blamed the Greek community for bombing them. And that's not me hypothesizing. This is confirmed by the people who were involved in the attacks. So this is precisely what they are trying to do now. They are proceeding with provocation and aggression in the hopes that aggression will lead to concessions. And it's what a colleague of mine, a Georgian colleague of mine, refers to as the Russian style of negotiation. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. And so in order to make what is yours negotiable, and in order to keep what's mine as mine, Turkey will continue a very aggressive stance. And so it's up to the European Union and the United States and the rest of NATO to figure out how to respond to that.
Dr. Novo, you mentioned earlier in one of your other responses that it appears that the United States' relationship with Cyprus and Greece has been improving. And it seems to have coincided with the increase in provocations that Turkey has embarked on, whether it's the conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, the acceleration of the disputes with regard to maritime jurisdiction, even something as recent as the opening of this beach resort in occupied territory on the island of Cyprus. Do you view this as a zero-sum game where the United States influence in one area and with one country causes another country to view it as a threat and provoke the kind of reaction that Turkey has exhibited?
Well, I think that both sides, both the United States and Turkey, are engaging in signaling here. And so the signal that the United States is trying to send as loudly as it can, given divided government and election year constraints, as well as formal diplomatic and treaty obligations to Turkey, the signal the United States is saying is, we do not appreciate provocative behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean. We don't believe that it is right, let's say, to threaten European Union members like Cyprus, or NATO members like Greece, which is also a European Union member. And so the signal of Pompeo going to Athens or Nicosia, the signal of publicly released statements, is to try and to get across to Turkey that we don't appreciate this aggressive behavior, and that instead of aggression leading to negotiation, leading to some sort of solution, we would prefer that negotiations begin without aggression so that they can proceed more smoothly towards some sort of solution. Even the German foreign minister, Heiko Maas, came out today and said to Turkey, please, we could do without any further provocations in the region. Let's just go back to trying to settle these disputes, these issues, these disagreements in a more productive way. And it's important that Germany come out and say this. Getting back to Dr. Carpenter's point about Europe, the European Union project works economically because of Franco-German cooperation. The European Union program has not gotten off the ground in the security realm because of a lack of Franco-German cooperation and often a lack of German buy-in, which exists for a whole set of domestic, political, and historical reasons, which we can't get into. But the European Union is not going to be a major security player until France and Germany get a coordinated policy together. This statement by Foreign Minister Maas is important in that it signals a sort of shifting of the German position, a gradual sort of walking of the German position over to the French position. So the United States desperately wants to avoid the problems becoming a zero-sum game. And so they are trying to signal to Turkey, please come back and tone down what you're doing so that it does, precisely so that it does not become a zero-sum game.
Dr. Carpenter, do you want to address that issue?
Just briefly, I think there's no question the United States is trying to send signals. But I suspect Turkey is going to regard those signals as pro forma, or at least rather anemic. I don't think that's going to deter the Erdogan government from pursuing the kinds of policies it has decided to pursue. This is very much a nationalistic agenda, and it's going to be very difficult for outside powers, even the United States, to have a decisive impact on that decision-making process. With regard to the European Union, Dr. Novo is absolutely correct that a lack of Franco-German unity with regard to policy on security issues has been a very important factor retarding the emergence of the European Union as a serious security entity. But there's another factor. The United States has actively, consistently discouraged any kind of even semi-independent action in the security arena by the European Union. That is considered what John Bolton described long before he became National Security Advisor. A strong European Union in the security arena is a dagger pointed at the heart of NATO, meaning a dagger pointed at the heart of US domination of European security affairs. And I think that is a thoroughly obsolete attitude, a misplaced attitude, a terribly corrosive and destructive attitude. We ought to be encouraging the European Union to emerge as a vigorous security actor. That's in the long term to our benefit, not our detriment. And I think dealing with Turkey may be one of the first cases in which the European Union as an entity can play a very important role.
So let's take your comment about encouragement by the United States to productively address these disputes. One gets the notion that the role that the United States really has served, for the most part, is that of cheerleader, standing on the sidelines, encouraging these NATO member countries to play nicely in the sandbox. What would you say is, if you were advising the next administration, putting aside who wins the election, the next administration, what they should do to try to ameliorate the disputes between these NATO member countries and to reduce the heat? What would be some of the advice that you would give them, or give the administration?
I guess my advice would be different. It would be for the United States to draw back. It would be to give a very blunt message to Turkey that the United States is not in that country's corner anymore. It does not regard it as a productive ally. It regards it at best as a independent and unpredictable force. And combined with that kind of message to Turkey, I think the United States should be pushing the major European powers individually and the European Union as an entity, push them forward to deal with Turkey and deal with Turkey on a fairly candid, blunt basis, that the friendly relationship would be welcomed. But if Turkey is determined to be a consistently turbulent, disruptive force, that the West generally is going to have to take that into account and react accordingly. structure its relations with Ankara accordingly. The days of very cordial diplomacy, I think, need to come to an end. We need to have, I don't want to say tough love because I'm not sure there's love involved, but we need to be very candid with Ankara at this point, very candid.
Dr. Novo, can you address that question, please?
Certainly. I mean, I think part of the candor with Turkey involves some carrots and some sticks. I agree with Dr. Carpenter that, you know, sort of the provocative behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean, if the United States is to be a credible security partner for Europe and a credible security partner for Nato, a credible security partner for Greece and Cyprus in particular, you know, there has to be a bit more of a stick rather than just kind of this occasional statement when it comes to Turkish behavior. But of course, that then goes back to, if you still want to have a productive relationship with Turkey, which I do think is important and necessary for American national security, there has to be a carrot as well. And so, without wanting to get too prescriptive, and also keeping in mind that I may be influenced by the fact that I'm teaching Machiavelli tomorrow, so this sort of realpolitik is very much in my mind. It becomes a question of national security priorities for the United States. Essentially, what are we willing to give Turkey in order to have them give us peace of mind in the Eastern Mediterranean? Because we don't have the coercive power to simply say to them, stop. I think we failed, at least. I mean, the way we've demonstrated, you know, us saying stop has not stopped them. So we can try to work with European partners to tell them stop more forcefully. We can offer them other things, though. I don't know what the United States is willing to trade for better Turkish behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the criticisms of President Trump's withdrawal of American forces from Syria and withdrawal of our support for Kurdish partners there was precisely that we appeared to get nothing for it. And so, without wanting to sound too Machiavellian or too realpolitik, if you give something up in international politics, you should get something for it. And so it becomes a question for the United States of how we prioritize the Eastern Mediterranean. I would argue that we should prioritize it quite highly, and that we should be willing to work with European partners and also incentivize Turkey in some other area to try to get them to do that. Maybe it's refugees, for example. Maybe it's Libya, whatever it may be. The second point about what I would say about American policy with Greece and Cyprus is that our support for them is very important and very productive, and that engagement needs to be broadened, and those relationships need to be deepened. Linkages need to be created with both countries beyond sort of the political side, beyond the statements, beyond the visits. And that most importantly means economic linkages, investment, trade, cooperation. So America's activities in Alexandroupoli are very important for this. Lots of colleagues in Cyprus, when they talk about, they're very pleased with increased relations with the United States. And they'll come out and say, you know something, we have a history of looking at being very positive with Russia. We're happy to get rid of Russia because we don't think they're a great partner and be closer to the United States. But you have to understand that that's going to come at a huge cost to us. It's going to come at a cost of tour operators and rental cars and hotel beds and economic partnerships and people incorporating their companies here and hiring our accounting firms. So if you want us to give that up, we're willing to do it, but the United States needs to understand that there needs to be a follow-through, a practical follow-through with that to increase economic relationships, increase cooperative relationships so that a genuine partnership can exist. Otherwise, you're going to leave these countries wanting more because their partnership is just going to consist of an occasional statement from the U.S. government.
So one final question, and then I have a question from one of our observers. The maritime jurisdiction issue has come up in the context of the mineral rights that are sought to be exploited by the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, right now, this week, there's a meeting of antagonists, Israel and Lebanon, with regard to the EEZ zone of of those two countries in disputes over, I think, 350 square miles of the Mediterranean. Do you see the mineral rights exploitation as something that could be used as a vehicle for dispute resolution between these Eastern Mediterranean antagonists? Or does it exacerbate the situation?
Well, at the moment, it's very much exacerbating the situation because Turkey is banging down the door. It wants in. It wants into all of these agreements, and it's also using the existence of the Turkish Cypriot minority as a way to claim that it needs to solve that issue. It needs to increase the rights of Turkish Cypriots in order to have them share in the potential of gas revenues as well. So the economist's hope, the businessman's hope is always, well, profit means happiness for everyone. Let's just get people to the table and we'll get rid of all these thorny political issues and we'll all be rich and then we can all go on vacation to Monaco. Unfortunately, the reality so far has been that it has increased Turkey's desire to sort of assert its position in the region, which of course has created pushback and fears in Cyprus and in Greece. And in some ways, it's also spooked investors as well about, is this really the wisest play that we can make if there's a sort of political risk that overhangs it?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carpenter, can you address that?
I would just say, candidly, you're getting a bit outside my area of expertise when it comes to special economic zones and a number of the overlapping claims. But that clearly is a matter for intense diplomacy. If those cannot be resolved, such conflicting claims become the source of geopolitical tensions and even potential for armed conflict. That's not just confined to the Eastern Med. That's true of a number of other areas in the world as well. So again, that puts a premium on creative diplomacy on the part of a number of powers.
All right, thank you. Let me go to our Q&A, and the first one is from former U.S. Ambassador to Qatar, Patrick Theros, and he asks this question. Greece clearly needs to increase its defense spending. They have benefited from excess defense equipment transfers, but these are limited and obsolete. Do you believe that either administration and Congress might consider some form of FMS grants or credits for a major procurement?
I would say that's possible. It's very, very difficult to predict. I would say that's probably a bit more likely with a Biden administration than it is with a second Trump administration. But there are a lot of different dynamics taking place that would impact that decision. I think Greece, ironically, is one of the NATO members that has been more serious about defense spending than a good many of the other members. But the need is probably greater for Greece than it is for a good many other NATO members. And again, primarily because of a certain fellow NATO member, as much as it is any outside threat.
Okay, Dr. Novo, do you have any response to that?
So, I mean, Dr. Carpenter is correct. Greece has always been spending above the NATO requirement, and we all know why. I mean, it spends above the NATO requirement because of its fears of Turkey. Unfortunately, because of the economic crisis in Greece, Greece's defense spending was basically halved. So its highs in the 2009 period or 2010, where it was spending $10 billion a year on defense. Now Greece is spending only about $5 billion. So that's been halved. Their economy is growing again slowly. We don't know the long-term effects of COVID and the disastrous impact it has on tourism, whether they'll be able to sustain that. But Greece's military does need a reboot. It does need to try to get its defense spending back up. And so grants and credits and loans would be one way to try to do that. I think there's also some equipment which is becoming, in need of replacement, and so it's an opportunity for the Trump administration to make a deal and sell things, which it enjoys doing. It may do that, but like Dr. Carpenter said, it's a very complicated issue.
I may just interject on that point. Greece is currently in a development of upgrading its 75 approximately F-16s on an agreement that was signed in 2018 to the tune of 1.5 billion. And they have just signed off to a deal with the French government regarding the Rafale planes. And they're also looking to procure 2 modern frigates, of which that tender will ultimately be going out sometime soon. So yes, Greece understands this. I was just meeting with the Greek military at the highest levels just a few weeks ago, and every one of them across the board made that point that they are desperately right now in, a buy-in mode to upgrade all their systems. And as you mentioned, of course, because of their NATO ally to the east. And the percentage of budget is approximately 2.2% of GDP. And at the highest, it was as high as 4 to 4.5% of GDP when times were better during its economy. So they understand the importance of upgrading and continuing to keep operational ready their armed forces.
One final question before we break this meeting up. Are the French and the Germans on the same side of the Greek-Turkish issue? It seems like the French have a much stronger position of rejecting Erdogan and a Turkish provocation. The French have sent ships into the Eastern Mediterranean to counter the presence of Turkish warships there. Germany seems to be viewed as being more pro-Erdogan. Is that the way you see it, or is that a misconception?
I would argue Germany is not pro-Erdogan, but it is doing a tightrope act, trying to be as neutral as possible. If there's a lean, it's a bit toward Turkey, but very slight. Mm-hmm. France has really shifted into an anti-Erdogan position in recent months, especially. And I think that's going to continue. That's another reason for a heart-to-heart dialogue between Paris and Berlin. They need to get on the same page with regard to that issue. And I think on this one, Germany may gradually move toward the position preferred by President Macron and the French government. I don't think we're going to see a dramatic change, but I don't see a movement in the other direction, greater tolerance of Turkey's disruptive behavior. That to me is not in the cards.
I agree with Dr. Carpenter. I wouldn't expect further accommodations of Turkey by Germany, and I would refer back to Foreign Minister Maas's statement for today. I think one reason why there is that slight tilt, as Dr. Carpenter explained it, is Germany is in a different position from France. Germany has to deal with the refugee issue more acutely, and so it doesn't want to rock the boat with Turkey. And Turkey, of course, as everyone knows, has its minority of Turkish citizens and guest workers. So it has to tread that line carefully as well. And it goes back to the point that there needs to be a more coherent and robust European response. I do think, though, France's response has been more rhetoric than going all the way for substance. In practice, there hasn't been such a huge difference between the French and the German response. They've both said you need to have negotiations. They've both come out and now criticized provocations by Turkey. It's true France has ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Germany, as far as I know, does not. But it's not such a gap in substance between the two positions.
Nick, if I may just maybe pick it up from here and close it out. Any last comments from yourself?
No, I was just going to thank Dr. Carpenter, Dr. Novo. I thought it was a very informative panel discussion, and I hope the folks that are watching agree. and I very much want to thank them for their time and their contribution.
Allow me, thank you again, Nick, for a tremendous job in facilitating this discussion, and of course, our two guest panelists. Permit me one comment and then a question from myself to the two panelists. Ted, if I may, Dr. Carpenter, my understanding of UNCLOS and how the United States treats UNCLOS, we are a signatory to it, but we have not ratified it. But we certainly adhere to it as customary international law. And in the case of at least this administration, and as it relates to the maritime boundaries in the Aegean and Turkey, our U.S. ambassador there, Pai, has come out unequivocally and has stated, you know, islands have continental shelves and islands have EEZ, of which he speaks for the policy of the United States as ambassador to Greece. So in that regard, I think the message has only come through. Greece has always stated that the only issues on a maritime agenda that it has with Turkey are continental shelf and EEZ and nothing more. Turkey wants to throw out the proverbial kitchen sink when it comes to that discussion, and whatever forthcoming agenda and whatever might happen in negotiations in Ankara in the near future, notwithstanding the latest provocative actions. Appeasement seems, unfortunately, from where I stand, gentlemen, has been the policy from Washington regarding Turkey. And as long as any appeasement comes out of Washington at any level, that emboldens Turkey to do the kind of actions that it does. We've never come down hard on Turkey and demand certain things by virtue of if you do, and if you don't, there are consequences and are hard consequences. It seems to me that's more of the position we need to undertake. I think that was alluded to strongly by Mr. Carpenter. Let me just ask this question. Let me do add, though, that this recent State Department spokesperson did come out and use the word deplores and unilaterally called out Turkey as it related to its recent actions with the ORIC Greece, some of the most hardest comments we've seen from the State Department maybe ever. So we appreciate that. But we've always taken the position that this area, which is fraught with instability, from the arc of instability from Libya coast all the way to the Albanian coast, and right smack in the middle is Turkey, creating a tremendous amount of problems in practically every theater in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. You said, Ted, that China is the primary focus, and it should be. But China is playing a role in the Eastern Mediterranean and even trying to put its footprint in Turkey. Russia, all of a sudden, has ships all over the place floating around in the Eastern Mediterranean and is trying to ultimately project its power as well. So isn't this area of great importance that it should not be relegated to the good people of the bureaucracy at the State Department, but should be also looked at the presidential, at the executive branch level, and the president should deal with this as well, which, from where I stand, it's always been relegated to the State Department to deal, with the Eastern Mediterranean, and the president only comes into play if there's ever really an acute crisis that could ultimately happen. Your comments, and we'll finish there.
I suspect that's not going to change materially. To be blunt, I think most administrations, unless there's an acute crisis in the Eastern Med, regard that as a second-tier arena. Now, you can argue whether that's a wise attitude or not, but I think that's the reality, and that's likely to increase going forward, not decrease. Washington's attention, especially at the presidential level, but also very much at the Pentagon, is increasingly focused on East Asia. That's the #1 priority, and I think that's going to increase in the coming years, inevitably. The U.S. Highest level of the defense and foreign policy community are focused on China and its ambitions. They're very worried about it. They're taking actions to try to counter China's strength and maneuvers. And it's not that the U.S. will ignore the Eastern Med. It's not going to happen. But it's not going to be a top priority, especially compared to East Asia going forward.
Dr. Novo?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, or maybe I would just frame it slightly differently, which is that the focus of the Pentagon right now has shifted away from talking about terrorism to talking about great power competition. And great power competition is very present in Europe, and it is very present in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, one thing that could make it of extreme importance for American policymakers is the fact that there it's one of the few places in the world where you have the overlap of four great powers with each other. You have the United States, you have the European Union, you have Russia, and you have China. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that the competition with China is by nature global, and that China's role in the Mediterranean and in Europe has been increasing dramatically. The most famous example of this is its investments in Piraeus, in Athens. Italy is right in the crosshairs for the Belt and Road Initiative. Nick, you were just alluding to China's push into Turkey and attempts to influence Turkish attitudes through investment. So I don't think that competition with China solely means a focus on the Pacific. Of course, the Pacific is going to be an enormously important theater for that, but competition with China is also going to play out in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Europe. And in that part of the world, four great powers overlap, and there is going to be heightened great power competition, which is a key point of the Pentagon's view of our national defense strategy going forward.
Very well. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you for a tremendous discussion here today. Our two panelists, again, Nick Chimicles, thank you again. And ladies and gentlemen, we certainly thank you all for tuning in today to watch this panel presentation. Our next AHI presentation will be next Wednesday, October 21. We always like to commemorate the catastrophe of Smyrna. And unfortunately, this year it's taken us a little longer than we would have liked to, but nonetheless, it's an important commemoration date, and we will host that next Wednesday, and you will be receiving information very soon. Once again, everyone, we thank you for tuning in. Thank you again to all our panelists and our moderator. Until next time, have a good day, a good afternoon, and a good week. And follow the candidates and look at what they're saying, and go out there and vote. Take care, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Nick.
And let me thank, of course, our producer, Emily Pandis, who does a tremendous job with our Zoom presentations. And of course, our legislative assistant, who does a lot of research for these presentations as well. And that's Elias Yarasulis. Thank you again. Take care.